Hi. So I would say that we live in a very imbalanced world, a world where the top 1% owns half of the world's wealth, and a world where the demand for resources far outweighs supply, and a world where I spend more time debugging than actually coding. And all these imbalances are bad for us, but do you know what they're worse for? The allocation of natural resources. And recently, within the last 50 years, due to industrialization, this imbalance has led to widespread pollution on Earth's land, oceans, and air. And the specific problem we're going to be looking at today is the issue of climate change due to the increase of greenhouse gases. And this greenhouse gas imbalance due to industrialization has led to the greenhouse effect being perpetuated, which has made Earth a higher temperature than it naturally is. And this has led to the widespread global climate emergency, which is evident by the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and annual emissions skyrocketing within the last 100 years. So this poses a huge problem for us because there's a lot of unknown effects that CO2 has, especially when it's in these levels. So we got to fight climate change together because it is such a huge problem. This is where the principles of environmental economics comes in to help create a sustainable future. Environmental economics is a subfield of economics that studies the impacts of environmental policies as well as externalities on supply and demand. The main differences between environmental economics and economics is the supply and demand curves. In environmental economics, external factors, aka externalities, are accounted for. However, in regular economics, they are not. Also, ecosystem services are measured in monetary value for environmental economics. So this means getting clean air, getting clean water, that does have a value and is accounted for when analyzing the economy. Also, the way we evaluate the wealth of nations is different. Wealth is conventionally calculated with GPI in environmental economics, but GDP in regular economics. And we'll dive into the differences between GPI and GDP in the further slide. So let's start with the core fundamental of an economy, which is supply and demand. At its core, every economy relies on this concept. So if there's too much supply than the demand, that's what we call a surplus. While if there's too much demand and too little supply, that incurs a shortage. But the goal of every economy is to hit an equilibrium point where the supply and demand meet, which leads to less waste. This is the traditional supply and demand curve. However, with the externalities in environmental economics, they are accounted for. And these externalities include the cost to the environment, the impact on ecosystem services, and the regulations that follow. So as you guys can see here, externalities can either negatively impact supply or positively impact supply. This is just one example that increases supply. This could be either due to cheaper labor, easier regulations to follow in developing countries, and a variety of other factors. The basics of evaluating a wealth of a nation is using GDP. GDP is the gross domestic product, and it measures the production and consumption of a nation, but it doesn't account for a lot of important data to accurately measure the progress of an economy. And as you guys can see here, the global GDP has been increasing for the last 50, 100 years. However, this does lead to a variety of consequences, the main one being increased waste. So as we said before, GDP is the measure of production and consumption. However, increased production and consumption does lead to more waste. And we'll find out how to deal with that later. So all of this waste is an externality not accounted for in conventional supply and demand curves. And we really should be accounting for this because who's really paying for all of this waste, all of this carbon dioxide going into the air? It's up to the ecological services in that nearby area. However, over time, that ecosystem can't handle the amount of pollution going in, and that's where everybody starts paying for it. So the purpose of environmental economics is to provide a sustainable economy, to harness the power of the economy, of its production and consumption cycle, to give back to the ecosystem. And we can do this through regulations, through policies, and a variety of acts. And we're also recycling the waste back into the production and consumption cycle. So this overall decreases the waste and pollution on Earth. Now, the goal of environmental economics is for government intervention to help direct that supply and demand. So we can help direct the supply and demand through a lot of ways. So a few examples is increasing the demand of electric vehicles through EV tax credits in California. If people have an incentive to use electric cars, they're more likely to use them. And increased gasoline taxes, decreasing demand for fossil fuels as a result, and cap and trade, which we'll explain in further slides. And we can also decrease supply of a certain negatively impactful product or technology. So these are some of the things that the government can do to help direct the supply and demand of these products and technologies to help the environment. Now, some of these products and technologies include clean energy technologies, such as windmills, solar farms, and you might be asking, why is there a burger on screen? I'm getting hungry. But yeah, the 5 for $39 is the cost of a McDonald's quarter pounder, but what should be the cost of having access to clean air, or the cost of getting rid of access to clean air? Well, that's where the cap and trade system comes in. We're valuing the ecosystem based on this service of kind of clean air service, the trees through, photosynthesis. That's a whole nother thing. But basically the idea of cap and trade is you can sell your carbon limits to other companies. So the overarching concept of this is harnessing the power of the free market economy to better our environment. And in this case, we're using, free trade to help limit the amount of carbon, but give people access if they really need it. Now, as I said before, we calculate wealth differently. In environmental economics, we use the genuine progress indicator, aka the GPI, which is very similar to the GDP, accounting for consumption and production, but it also accounts for other factors. And the GPI has remained relatively stable and unchanged over the last 20, 50 years. So we're not progressing far, although we have better technology. So the problem is Kuznets curve. Everybody wants to get rich before they start worrying about the environment. This guy Kuznets made this curve to represent that. There comes a point in a country's economic progress where they start caring about the environment because it will help them. But up until that point, we don't care about the environment at all because we're just trying to get rich. But don't worry, we're on our way to a green future. Governments and private companies around the world are creating environmental policies and also funding green energy. So in conclusion, environmental economics harnesses the power of the economy and adopts the idea of environmental ethics to help create a sustainable economy and a sustainable future for us in the present and for future generations. Thank you so much for watching my presentation. I'm looking forward to watching your guys's soon. Goodbye.